asked to be co-chairs. First things we did was ask Rabbi Shefrin if he would be willing to give us a class, and he said absolutely. And so months later, we are lucky enough to have him here tonight. And I think we are going to be treated to an evening of learning, wisdom, and if I know you, Rabbi Shefrin, just a little bit of humor. So you didn't pay the big bucks to come and hear me, so I'm going to turn the meeting over to Rabbi Shefrin.
Thanks, Judith. I appreciate the warm welcome. I'm happy to see everybody. I didn't prepare any jokes tonight. But I don't know, maybe we'll see what happens. Maybe we'll find a reason to laugh together as the evening goes on. Thanks for that warm introduction, Judith. Tonight, friends, and I'm excited for tonight and for next Wednesday as well. I wanted to share with you, I want to introduce you, if you've never met him, to Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. He's a famous figure in our world, and what we're going to do is you're going to hear a little bit of who he is. I'm going to introduce you to him, sort of a little biography kind of thing. We'll study some of his texts. We're going to hear over the next 2 sessions some music that has been inspired by him, some art that's been inspired by him. But we're going to find out who this fascinating character of Jewish tradition is. And one of the reasons that I wanted to share him with you is he is in many ways the antithesis of Reform Jew. And in some ways, he's also like the epitome of a Reform Jew. He's just this wild and varied character who I find to be fascinating. Is one of those teachers and rabbis and figures in Jewish life that anytime I come across anything from him, I'm sort of like, whoa, there's almost never a dull moment with him. And so I wanted to share him with you. And that was what I was looking forward to with these classes. So shall we begin? All right. So I want to give you some background on Rabbi Nachman. First and foremost, I'd love to show you a picture of him, but they don't exist. There are, artist renderings, but none of them seem to be accurate. He was pretty adamant in his life about not having his image captured. He wanted, I think, when he realized the sense of he's this interesting, mystical character, I think there was a sense that he didn't want to be remembered for what he looked like, but rather what he left behind in his short life. So let's begin. So it's important to get to know Rabbi Nachman. You actually have to know the world from which he came. He is a Hasidic rabbi. He comes from the world of Hasidism. Hasidism, you can take us back to the 18th century, mostly in Eastern Europe. It was an Orthodox spiritual revivalist movement that came onto the scene in Jewish practice, filled with charismatic leaders, filled with Rebbes, as they were called. And just to give you a bit of context, if you imagine in the 19th century, not long after this way of practicing Judaism burst onto the scene, if we take ourselves back to Eastern Europe, we can really picture that throughout Eastern Europe, just in 100 short years, that Hasidism took such a hold in the community that about half of all European Jews, Eastern European Jews, were practicing Hasidic ways of living, that they were part of the Hasidic movement. That's a big number and a fast movement. And what was really happening in the state of Jewish life at this time is the majority of folks, previously in the 18th century, were practicing very scholarship-based, very learning-based, very rigid ways of Jewish life. And that group became to be known amongst Hasidic Jews as the mitnagdim, the opponents, because Hasidic Jews were finding a different path towards God and towards tradition. They were much less interested in formalism, much less interested in sort of each Jew becoming scholarshiply wise, much more interested in creating relationship with God and finding the divine flow in daily life, much more interested in finding joy and expression in their Jewish practice. So things like dancing and song and joy and mysticism became much more at the forefront of Jewish practice, daily life, when Hasidism took hold. Hasidism, the first real founder of Hasidut is, you may know this name, the Baal Shem Tov. He's referred to as the keeper of a good name, the master of a good name, who is this teacher, this mystic, this meditator, this wanderer, who was famous for the stories that he told, and the stories and the way that he represented Jewish values and mitzvot were transmitted by him. And it took hold of, hundreds of thousands of people. And as this took hold, this group, these opponents, the mitnagdim, the sort of other side of Jewish life, really didn't get it. They didn't understand this spectacle that was happening with these sort of uneducated Jews who were singing and dancing and finding joy, and clapping their hands in the middle of services. There was a vibrancy that I think many of us experience in our Jewish practice today that was so foreign to the way things had been. And at the time, the Hasidic movement took real hold. And you're very likely more familiar than you realize if you're not sure about Hasidic Judaism. Out of the followers of the Baal Shem Tov, a few generations later, was Shneur Zalman of Liadi, who we credit as the founder of the Chabad movement. So Chabad came from this Hasidic, I don't want to say revolution, but that's really what it was, right? A new way of practicing Jewish life that was so de-emphasizing study, and emphasizing a blend of magic and miracles and folk tales and joyousness throughout. I mentioned that there were dynasties amongst the Rebbes. There were these charismatic leaders who were, their sons, and then the son-in-laws were taking on followers from the previous generation. So quickly, over a few generations, the movement grew. And unfortunately, as I mentioned, it was in Eastern Europe, and the Holocaust was devastating to the Hasidic population. Today, we know that throughout our world, there's lots of Hasidic folks, especially concentrated in New York and in Israel. I read a population study that said that in 2011, that 15% of all of the Jews in Israel identified as Hasidic. Which is a large number if you look at all the Jews in Israel and just percentage-wise, and how the movement has continued to thrive and reemerge. And if you were wondering, I mentioned that the mitnagdim, the opposition, who are they in opposition to? Well, the Chassid comes from the word chesed. It comes from the word of sort of piety. Hasidim are known as the pious ones. So their belief system in contrast to the sort of normal practice. And that's one of the reasons I feel like Reb Nachman, who we'll learn about in a moment, is like at its core like a Reformed Jew. Like he was really doing things differently than the mainstream of Jewish practice at that time. And that's a core value of Reformed Judaism, if we look back at the history of. So Rebbe Nachman of Breslov, he was, amongst many things, famously, he was the great grandson of the Besht, of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidic Judaism. So in his family line, in his bloodline, were the founders of this movement. And so he was super deeply influenced by them. His grandfather, in fact, was also Reb Nachman of Horodenka, was the descendant of the Maharal of Prague. So you've got all of these lines, this lineage that lead to this fascinating figure. He was born in a small town called Medzhbyzh, and I always pronounce that wrong, so I hope that was close, in the Ukraine. He was born right around 1772. We don't know exactly when he was born. We actually don't even know that he was absolutely the great grandson of the Besh, but it seems from most scholarship that it's very likely as such. His childhood is fascinating. He didn't have a ton of formal education outside of the Jewish world. He never ended up in university, anything like that, but he was known as an incredible student, a student of Jewish text. And I guess somebody referred to him as a spiritual prodigy. Just from the time he was young, he was very into his prayer and spirituality. And he did a lot of wandering, and he had a lot of conflict in his life as a young person. And that's actually part of his family lineage. His great grandfather, the Besht, the Baal Shem Tov, was an orphan and a wanderer, and was always seeking. And you could sort of see that in the story of Reb Nachman when he was young, that there was this sense of isolation. Even though he was surrounded, he was seeking something from a very, very young age. And to put it into context, let's think about 1772 and what the world looked like. Here we are, this pious Jew, this young Jew, exploring this spiritual and intellectual and way of expressing Jewish life, right as America is being founded, right as the Enlightenment is going on throughout Europe. And so even though he wasn't directly affected by some of those things, the place that he held in the world seems appropriate for him to sort of have this newfound way of seeing life and seeing Jewish life. Um, Fascinating stuff right out of the gate. His greatest influences, besides his great grandfather's teaching, are the book of the Zohar, the Kabbalistic core text that was codified by Shimon Bar Yochai, and the teachings of the Arizal, Isaac Luria, who's credited as being sort of the founder of Kabbalistic Judaism. So you have this mix of Kabbalah, right, really mystical stuff, and then this sort of formalism that he was raised around, but found his way in Hasidic Judaism. As was custom at the time, he was married off at the age of 13 to a woman named Sasha. And by the time he was 20, his rabbinate, his becoming a rabbi, his leadership was really in full force. He had lots of followers already by the time he was 20. And during that time when he was building his following with his teachings and his way of practice, in around the year 1798, in his 20s, he made a pilgrimage to the land of Israel. And that pilgrimage is filled with stories of perilous moments of violence and storms and just difficulty throughout. But that's the challenging part of it. And so I mentioned conflict is a key thing that involves Reb Nachman. On one side of it, there's this amazing journey where he fought through violence and storm. And on the other side is this sort of intimate, homely, wonderful experience where he was in Haifa and in Tiberias and in Sfat and meeting other Hasidic Jews and helping to found and inspire these communities in Israel. And he became this honored guest and a name that was known throughout the region. So we have this dual thing going on, this conflict of like the challenge and then the sort of peacefulness, which will be a theme in the way he lived his Jewish life. After that tour in Israel, he returns back to Europe. He ends up in a town called Zlatopol, which is also in present-day Ukraine. And it was really here that his formalization of his teachings took place. And one of the things that's really of note is this is the time period in his life and the place in his life where he had his own set of mitnagdim, of oppositions. He had lots of detractors, people that were totally opposed to his way of Jewish practice, thought it was, like the equivalent of idol worship in a way. In fact, even in his own family, there were people, other rabbis and leaders that were not okay with how he was doing things. Unfortunately, he had no sons, so his lineage wasn't passed on. Well, I mean, he had sons, but they didn't live. He and his wife had 8 children, and 4 of his daughters made it past infancy. So there was no lineage past Reb Nachman. So when we speak of Reb Nachman of Breslov, and we think of this dichotomy that you'll hear me talk about a lot, of challenge and of peace, of spirit and of disappointment, of depression, they had children, but also at the same time had death in their lives. He is known for that struggle in his life. That's just an example of it. We think about when we think of him, he's often thought of as somebody who had an unbelievable, ecstatic and connected relationship with God. And also he's known for having moments of the darkest depressions one could experience, of challenges with mental health, and psychological complexity. So simultaneously, this mystic and this isolated person in pain is how we can think of him, these intense emotional lows, and also at the same time, ecstatic experiences with thousands of followers joining with him. I want to share with you 2 things that he's famous for, just to give you a context of why I think he's such a fascinating character. One of them is he is credited with the nigun. He is credited to be the one who discovered, who brought into our practice the wordless melodies that we sing. When at Temple Emanu-El, when we sing at the beginning of Micha Mocha, we sing yai dai 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 da da dai yada dai 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 dai. That's Debbie Friedman. But the idea of a wordless melody as part of our prayerful experience is credited to Rabbi Nachman. That's incredible. We'll talk more about that in the next session next week. But the other thing that I wanted to share with you, that I think is just a great example of who he is and one of the things he's most famous for. He is credited with pulling out of the 150 Psalms, 10 Psalms called Tikkun HaKlali, the repair of the vessel. And his notion was, if you say these 10 Psalms, you have a greater access to healing and repair in the world. So he took this complex thing, right? Like this idea, if you think about 150 Psalms, that's a lot of scholarship and study to know all 150 Psalms. But if you just focus on 10, and these are the 10, you have a greater way of accessing the divine, a greater way of accessing teshuvah and repentance and healing and peace in your life. He has famously said that if a follower of his recites these 10 Psalms every day, that from the world to come, he will make sure, he'll be like, he'll have God's ear and make sure that that person is seen in the most positive regard in the heavens above, which is like a beautiful concept, that even in his death, he was looking upon his followers and those in the world and trusting in our tradition to be that sense of healing for him. I mentioned his sort of this struggle that he had in both sides of his life. He really emphasized simplicity in comparison to the intense scholarship and formalism that was present in the majority of Jewish life when he came into his well-known state. He emphasized simplicity in prayer and in tzedakah and charity giving and in faith. He just wanted things to be simple and good, and it was all about God. Everything that he wanted from his followers and from his own life was just about connecting to God. It really kept it that simple. He wrote a lot. Well, he only wrote a little, actually. One of his followers, Rav Natan, one of his disciples, was kind enough to write down all of his formal lessons and many informal conversations that they had as well. And so we have some collections of teaching that we have access to today. The most famous one is called Likutei Maharan, which is really his Hasidic and Kabbalistic teachings about how to be in the world. Another famous one is called Sipurei Ma'asiot. It is a compilation of stories that he told. There's another book that talks about his trip to Israel that I mentioned earlier. And then famously, and so of course mystically, there's two books that we no longer have. One is called Sefer HaGanuz, the hidden book, and one is called Sefer HaNisraf, the burned book. The story says that he wrote this book that was too intense and too complex, and he only wanted things simple, so he burned it. And so we no longer have that. And then the story about Sefer HaGanuz is that Rav Natan, his disciple that was keeping records of everything, wrote it down, didn't understand it. It was too complex and too hidden, and he got rid of it. And upon the death of Rabbi Nachman, he got rid of it. So we have no access to these two books that may or may not have existed, but what a mystical, interesting thing. So later on in his life, he relocated to the city of Breslov, which is in present-day Ukraine. And I mentioned he was the first and last Rebbe of this place, and therefore has his namesake. He is the Rebbe Nachman of Breslov, and he's the only one. He's the only Rebbe of Breslov. There, he relocated with his wife, who died at a young age. She died in her late 20s, I believe, of tuberculosis in 1807. And just a few years later, when he was 38, Reb Nachman fell to the same disease. And he died there as well, and died in a city called Uman, a place where they had relocated after where he had and his family had relocated after his wife had died. They ended up in Uman, a very famous place, which we'll talk more about next week as well. But the great story, and just to give you another example of the sort of legend and mystery of Reb Nachman, he apparently had visited there in his travels at some point, and had visited with somebody, and they had gone to the local Jewish cemetery, to where he stood in between two gravestones and looked at the names of two Jews that had apparently been killed in a massacre a few decades earlier. And he looked and said, "This seems like a good place to be buried." And the legend says that that is where he is buried to this day. And his place of death is a pilgrimage spot for his followers. Tens of thousands visit Uman and visit his grave, specifically on Rosh Hashanah, but throughout the year. It is a place of pilgrimage amongst the Breslover Hasidim. We'll talk more about the style of dress of his followers and some of the ways that he fits into sort of neo-Chassidut, this modern Hasidic world. But I just want to wrap this section of sort of you getting to know him and his history, a little bio, with the message that I think that he and the Breslovers around the world would want you to know about his way of practice and his way of leading. It's really simple. It's about joy. It's about simcha. It's about happiness. I mentioned it's about simplicity in prayer. It's about simplicity in faith. It's about simplicity in knowing yourself and knowing others, of knowing talent, of knowing emotion, and doing things all for God. It's just simply about creating relationship and connection to the divine. There was a great quote in one of the books that I've read about him. It simply says, if you're going to be a musician, great, be a musician for God. If you're going to be a mechanic, great, be a mechanic for God. If you're going to be the guy that works at the grocery store, great, work at the grocery store and do it for God. This, I feel, is that doing things joyfully and just simply for God is like the core message within all of the complexity and the dichotomies of Rebbe Nachman that I wanted to share with you tonight. So with that said, I wonder if there's anybody who is interested in being a reader tonight. And if you're interested in being a reader, if you would, I'll put some stuff on the screen as we go through, and just put your name in the chat, and I'm happy to call on somebody who's reading or wants to be one of our readers tonight. So with that in mind, I'm going to share my screen now. I have a bunch of text. I doubt we'll get through all of them. But the first text that I want to share with you is one of my favorites. It's one of the first texts I was taught when I was early on in my rabbinic studies from Reb Nachman. So Reb Nachman of Breslov. Can you all see my screen? Can I get a couple thumbs ups? Okay, great. Thank you. Give me one moment to readjust this so that I can see most of you. In his book, Likutei Moharan, we find this verse, and I'm going to read it to you in Hebrew. And it'll be really the only Hebrew of our time together, some brief moments, but I wanted you to just sort of hear the flow of how he wrote and how Reb Natan wrote down what Reb Nachman was teaching, because there's a music to it, there's a flow, there's a poetry. And as I mentioned, the first sort of subject that we'll dive into a little bit is conflict. So I'm going to read it to you in Hebrew first, from Likutei Moharan. Reb Nachman teaches this. Hamachloket hi bichinat briat haolam. Ki ikar briat haolam al yedei chalal hapanui. Ki below ze haya hakol ein sof velo haya makom livriat haolam. Ve'al ken tzimtzem haor litzdaden lenaseh chalal panui uvtocho bara et kol habriya al yedei hadibur. V'chein bichinat hamachloket ki ilu hayu kol hatalmidei chachamim echad lo haya makom livriat haolam rak al yedei hamachloket shebneihem behem nechlakim ze mizeh. V'chol echad moshech atzmo letzad acher al yedei ze naaseh beineihem bechinat chalal hapanui shehu bechinat tzimtzum haor letzdadim shebo hu briat haolam al yedei hadibur. It's got a nice flow to it now. So what he says in this text, and I'll read the first text and then we'll go on to some of our readers. He says, Hamachloket, the disagreement, and what he's specifically speaking of is the arguments that the sages had, how the entire Talmud is filled with rabbis arguing about how to do Jewish life, filled with the Mishnah, filled with arguments, Machloket, the disagreements, the conflict. He says disagreement in its nature is very similar. It's just like the creation of the world. For the creation of the world came about in essence by way of open space, as this translator defines it, chalal hapinui. That open space, I want to give you just a moment of context. The Kabbalistic understanding of how the world was created is that God is everything. God is Ein Sof, without end. So if God is everything, how did we come about? And the concept is complex but simple. God contracted into God's self through a process called tzimtzum and made space. God made space within God for the universe and for us and for Earth to be created. So God says that the creation of, Reb Nachman says the creation of the world came about in essence by this way of open space, by this sort of destruction of God's self in a small way to create space for us, without which all would have been endless divinity. And there have been no place for the creation of the world. Therefore, God withdrew light to the margins, right, to this the end space of the endless space, and the open space was formed. And in that space, God created the world through acts of speech. We know from our Torah, God spoke the world into being. So that speech, Reb Nachman is picking up on, that speech that the world is created in, that sort of tension, that almost explosion, that intricate coming into self, creating that conflict that we hear about in the Talmud and the Mishnah. That speech, that's the core of everything. That's where the world was created. And so it is too, he says, with our disagreements. For if all the sages of every rabbi of the Talmud was of one mind, there'd be no place for creation in the world. It is only by way of the disagreement between them and their division, their dividing from one another, that each one drawing to a particular side, having their own opinions, that open space, that creative open space, comes into being between them, which at its core, in its nature, is like the same withdrawing of the primordial divine light to the margins. That same space that God made room for God's self in the midst of the creation, of which creation can take place, that same speech, when God spoke the world into being, he's comparing to our sages. And the reason I think he's sharing it with us is that it's not just about the sages, it's also about us and our speech and what we can potentially create. But it all comes from conflict, which is a core thing to understand about Rebbe Nachman. Everything in his life was challenged. So in his writing, I love this translation in this Hebrew, but I wanted to actually go on in this particular writing of his and read you the next two paragraphs, because I think it's helpful in making it about us, not just about the sages and not just about God's creation. So it continues, everything that they say is only for the sake of creating the world, which is done by them in the empty space between them. For the sages create everything with their words. And he quotes from the book of Isaiah, as it is written, you are my people, Ami. But then he points out, he says, instead of reading the word Ami, as my people, read it Imi, meaning with me. Just as I create heaven and earth with words, God says in the Zohar, through the Zohar, you do the same. Not just the sages, not just God, but you do the act of creation when you speak. So not only through argument, but always. And it continues, but you must be careful not to speak too much. Say only what is needed for creating the world, and not more. For in the original moments of creation, the vessels that contain the greatness of the light that they shattered, that there was too much light, and the shattering of the vessels led to the existence of husks that mask the divine in the world. If one sage talks too much, he causes husks to come into existence. It's like too much light that leads to the breaking of vessels, which leads to the existence of the husks that mask the divine. In short, when the world was created, the light that happened when God contracted into God's self exploded. And that divine light that was flowing through the universe is what we talk about, the divine spark in each one of us. Each one of us has that light inside of us from that moment of creation. And it is with disagreement and argument and too much speech, and when we do things that aren't good in the flow of the universe, that these husks, we'll call them shades, that light gets shaded and we can't connect to the divine in the universe. A big concept to start off with. But that's at the core of everything about Reb Nachman. He's constantly in conflict. He's constantly in this tension between speech and silence, between saying too much and not saying enough. He's constantly dealing with the conflict of his life and the division around him, right? The other group of Jews, the other group of practicing Jews, the challenges of death and health in his own life. It's very, very intense stuff, but beautiful. So that, by way of introduction, is a hint at some of the writings of Reb Nachman that we have to go from. So I'm actually going to invite Rita Feeder, if you would. Oh, and Ellie's here too. Great. If you would, we're going to read from another collection of Reb Nachman, another example into the understanding of conflict in his life. I'm going to not open up the questions from that first text, because we could spend this session and the next session talking about creation and the Kabbalistic understanding. And I want to get more into Reb Nachman rather than the Kabbalistic understanding of stuff. But I just wanted to give you that taste. It was the first text I really studied from him, and it blew me away to think about having an argument with somebody and the impact that has on the creation of the world. To think about when I stand on the bima and give a sermon, to think about the impact that has on the continuing creation of the world. To think about those moments of silence and the impact that has on the continued creation of the world is really powerful. So Rita, if you would read the first couple paragraphs from Sichlot Haran, please. I'll invite you to unmute if you haven't already. Rita, are you still here? Oh, no, I think we may have lost Rita. Oh, she's not there. Adrian, I saw that you were willing to read. Would you mind?
Yes, sure.
Great, thank you.
The world is full of strife and division between the peoples of the world and within every city and within each household and between neighbors and between each person and their spouse and their children and between their children and their servants. No one takes to heart the ultimate point, that people die every day. The day that has passed will never return, and they will come closer to death every day. Know that everything is one. The private strife within a family and the other examples mentioned above are also the very same strife that exists between rulers and peoples. For each person in a household is the counterpart of a certain people, and they provoke one another just as there is war between peoples. Also, it is possible to recognize the traits which each person shares with a particular people, for the character traits of the peoples are known. For example, that a certain one is angry and bloodthirsty, and so on. And similarly, we can find these character traits among the individual members of the household. And even if someone does not want to fight, but rather to dwell in quiet and tranquility, nonetheless, they are also forced into conflict and struggle, just as with wars between rulers and peoples. Continue?
Yes, please.
A certain people might want to dwell in tranquility without any conflict at all. On the contrary, it is willing to acquiesce to these peoples many times, but nonetheless, it is forced into war against its will by warring peoples competing for its allegiance. And so too, we find private conflicts within a household, as mentioned above. For a person is themselves a miniature universe, and the entire universe and everything in it is found within them. So all the more does a household contain all the warring peoples in it. Therefore, a person dwelling alone in the forest could potentially go insane. This happens because all the peoples are included in them, and they provoke one another, forcing the person to continually emulate a different people, depending on which people is dominating the others. For all of the peoples are all included in the individual. Therefore, a person can go completely insane because of the overturning of their character traits each time a different people comes to dominate. But when one lives with people, the conflict can spread out among all those living with this person or their neighbors. The strife in the house of a tzaddik, righteous person, is also related to the wars between peoples. and also the wars between the tribes of Israel, which are fighting one another, Ephraim and Judah, and so on. And when the Messiah comes, let it be speedily in our days, then every variety of strife and division will be annulled, and there will be great peace and wholeness in the world, as it is written, they will neither hurt nor destroy, for the knowledge of God will fill the world like the water that covers the sea.
Thank you so much, Adrian.
You're welcome.
So friends, I'm intentionally stopping the share. That was a lot. What Adrian just read is a lot to digest, and she's nodding her head and she read it. I want to ask the question, what did you hear in that? What's something that you got in there? Because there was a lot there. Raise of hands, who's got something? Who's going to share this? What did they just hear in that long and kind of on point and relative to our life today's? Ike, I see your hand up.
It's obvious that he was the precursor of modern psychotherapy. In fact, it's family therapy, it's relational therapy. I mean, this is what he's talking about. It's the conditions that we see in our lives and the conditions that we see in our countries and our conflicts with other countries. So it's very, very insightful.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So just to encapsulate, you heard a psychological understanding of relationship and conflict within families and within countries, warring nations, or even nations that don't want to be drawn into war, but nice. Phil or Adrian, I see your hand up.
A couple of things struck me as I was reading it. Firstly, that how someone who wants tranquility can just be brought into a warring state or an unrestful state against their will. Certainly that happens in wars, but it happens in families, it happens in friendships, it happens in communities where we can get caught up in something and in events that we really don't want to be there, but the momentum is there and we find ourselves thrust, if not in the middle of it, but at least we're going along for the ride. Yeah. And then secondly, the different parts of a person, I thought was really interesting. As Ike was talking about psychotherapy, there is in psychotherapy addressing the parts of yourself that if you are not tranquil, that to listen to the different parts of yourself and let one part speak and hear what that part is saying. And then kind of like at a meeting, one part of you gets to be the chair at the meeting. And you listen to what that person has to say. So I found that really incredible that he knew that.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
It really struck me.
Yeah. So I want to try to encapsulate your 2 points. One, the second one was not only is there this sort of warring factions amongst countries or within family, but inside the individual, there's all these different parts that are constantly in tension with another.
Yes.
Right? That sort of conflict exists. Yeah, that's I want to add, because I think the first part was more of a, it lends itself to what Ike was saying as well. So that's fascinating, beautifully said. Thank you for that. Who else noticed? Ellen, yes, please. Ellen Zippin.
I felt that he was stressing that every person is the same, that from the ruler of the country down to the most humble workman, we all are sharing the same conflicts within us and between one another, so that nobody is, just that we are all, I got that feeling of the sameness of all people, no matter where they are.
Beautiful, beautiful. So just to reflect on his life and how why I think this is such an important text from him, that conflict that he had with the other Jews in his area, with his own relationship with seeking with God, and all these struggles, he traveling the world, and it's all there, that each one of us goes through this, right? As individuals, within our families, in our people, in our nations, it's all there. And that conflict exists for all of us. He was, I think you're right. I think he was very insightful. I think he saw and felt the pain and the simultaneous joy of that. I'm the same as someone else. That's amazing and wonderful. We're all equal. And also, but wait a minute, I have my own stuff, good and bad. And there's pain in that too. And he's holding space for both of those in this thing. And one thing that I haven't heard anybody point out yet, we'll take one or two more comments on this. Yes, Emily. Oh, Ellie, hi.
Hi. Part of what I heard too was that he said that people come with traits, and that some people come with a particular trait that's more forward or more active than others. And that if there isn't a way to try to keep those in balance, and there's opposing forces putting pressure, that that can become disrupted. But it also gives us some hint or some hope that if you're aware of that, that perhaps you could take your best trait and share it with other people, so that eventually you could repair the damage that's being done by the outside pressure of everything just sort of being in chaos.
Fantastically said. Love it. The thing I was going to point out, and I'm so glad you raised your hand, is he has that one thing where he subtly says, and even if somebody like wanted to go and completely isolate in the forest all by themselves, there would still be war. There would still be conflict. There would still be, because we bring those traits with us, right? Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. And that's like that self-awareness that he had to name that, right, comes from his own experience, right? I mentioned that he is all about ecstatic joy and also had these incredible bouts of intense depression. Really nice. One last comment on this this text before we move forward, because Emily, Ellie, we're going to work on the next thing. We're going to look at how can a person get better at that. One of the things you talked about. Roz, you unmuted. Did you have a comment?
Reminded me of, like, I think it was Many Faces of Eve, where you have somebody who's got multiple personalities. Also, you said, what year was he born?
In the late 1700s, around 1770.
Okay, so he'd have also gone through the French Revolution and the start of the Napoleonic
Yes,
age.
that
where
would have
you
been
had
in the neighborhood,
wars.
but not necessarily in his sort
It's
of
not
in
in his
purview.
shtetl,
Right.
but at the same time, because with Napoleon Bonaparte marching across the whole of Europe, he'd have got knocked on the door there and been in the neighborhood.
Right. Well said.
So anyway.
All right. So I think we've got a bit of a foundation of what conflict looks like in his life now. Okay. Thanks, Rabbi. That's really useful. What a wonderful insight into the tension that exists in us. If your whole point is that we're supposed to connect deeper to God and be in relationship with God and find joy, how do we go about doing that? So one of his most famous teachings, one of the things he's most famous for, I want to share with you at this time. We had a bunch of people offered to read. How about Danny Weiss? Why don't you take this one? You're muted though, my friend. There you go.
Of course, I get the word that I cannot pronounce.
Excellent. So let's define that word. It's from the Hebrew. It's hit bodedut. You can all say it with me on the count of three. 1, 2, 3. Hit bodedut. Nice.
Is the highest asset. And
so let's define it first before you read.
Okay.
So hit bodedut is, if we were going to translate it directly, it would probably be self-seclusion. And we'll go from there. Okay.
Hitbodedut is the highest asset and greater than everything. That is, to set aside for oneself at least an hour or more for secluding oneself in some room or a field and speak one's peace with one's maker, using words that evoke favor, placate and conciliate in order to entreat and plead with God, that God bring one closer to God, to genuine divine worship. This prayer and conversation should be in the language one normally uses, one's native tongue, because it is difficult for a person to say everything they want to say in the holy tongue. Also, being unfamiliar with that language, one's heart is not moved by the words, as we are not accustomed to speaking Hebrew. But in our native tongue, in which we normally speak and converse, it is much easier, and so more likely for one to feel contrition. That is because the heart is drawn to a person's native tongue and closer to it on account of his familiarity with it. Even if occasionally a person's words are sealed and they cannot open their mouth to say anything at all to God, this itself is nonetheless very good. That is, the readiness and the presence before God and the yearning and longing to speak despite the inability to do so. This in itself is also very good. And in one's native tongue, one can express oneself fully. Everything that is in the heart they should express and tell to God, be it remorse and repentance for the past, or pleas to genuinely merit drawing closer to God from this day forward, or the like, each individual according to their level. One should be very careful to make this a daily practice and a scheduled time, but the rest of the day, one should be happy.
Thank you, Danny. I'm going to scroll back up to the top for a moment. Actually, let me see if I can make my screen a little bit bigger. Okay. Just want to give everybody a moment to sort of look back at what we read. I'll let you know also, you see capitalized the words holy tongue. Lashon Kodesh is another way of saying Hebrew. I'd like to open the floor for comments. I think this is one of his instructions to us of how to sort of combat that conflict, what we're supposed to do and how we're supposed to be. And as he says at the very beginning, this is the most important thing in his practice. He tells you, if you're going to be a Breslover, right, if you're going to be a Reb Nachman follower, the most important thing you got to do each day is, and I'm going to let you all fill in the blank. I'm going to stop the share and open the floor for comments. What did you learn? What is he telling you to do? What are the instructions? Barbara Field, you look like you want to say something, but I don't want to pressure you into it. Ruth, you have the floor. Ruth Skoll, and then Alan Orenberg. Ruth, if you'll please unmute.
Okay, here. I think from your introduction, you compared his teachings with the teachings of the Orthodox, really Orthodox learned community up until that time. Mm-hmm. And the Orthodox learned community only learned in Hebrew, which unless you could speak and understand Hebrew, you really didn't know what you were reading, and the prayers meant nothing. I think he's bringing it down to the people and saying, yeah, use your own language because it will be meaningful to you. And then you can talk to God the way you know how to talk to God, and it will be meaningful and God will hear you even in your own language.
Nice. Thank you. Alan, if you'll unmute too, please. And then Barbara, I've seen you've unmuted. So Alan, you have the floor.
The first premise is that God removed himself from some of the space so that there would be space for creation. I think this builds on that thought that even if you are alone, make the time alone. If you are or not able to express yourself being in the space with the Lord, gives you access to that potential for communication.
Nice. So it's a, the way you speak about it, I'm hearing that it's like it's going to a physical space. It's not just a spiritual thing. Like, yeah, we could always sit wherever we are. Right? Oh, I'm going to commune with God. But he's saying, no. Go somewhere. Go into this space that's created and be there and try to talk to God. Very nice. Love that. Barbara, did you want to share something?
Sure. Just adding to what the two people just said before me, it's so generous to speak in your own language, in your own way, not just in Hebrew if you weren't used to it or whatever. And also to set aside that time, like now there's so much meditation and mindfulness. So set aside that time to be alone and be with God. And I love the generosity that he has too. It's okay if you're just present and speak from the heart, say what's bothering you, whatever, but also if you can't say anything, it's enough just being there. I love that.
Me too. Well said. And one of the words that stuck out at me as we read this through was his instruction of like how to talk to God. He says, yeah, make your request, but like placate God if you need to, like whatever you need to do. Like that's a fantastic offer for me to be like, all right, like I don't know what I'm gonna do, so I'm gonna maybe a little, like it's great. I saw a couple other hands. Who else had their hand up? Do I see the Reverend J. Michael Povey and then Judith Koziel, please? You're still muted, my friend. All right, Judith, do you want to go first and then we'll have Michael follow?
Much of what I was thinking about was said, but I think it was the instruction to set aside time, that it's important, that it's not like when I can do it, I can squeeze it in. And, which we are so tempted to do. Yes, when I finish this, then I'll meditate or something like that. But also that what you're doing is so important that however you do it matters. It's not the form, it's not the style, it's not the historical way you stand or you sit or you look this way or that. It's your way with God. So it gives permission, and yet it also gives a little discipline that this is what you should be doing.
Nice. Just to revisit the first line, right? It's greater than everything else. It's the highest asset. It's to set aside for oneself at least an hour or more for secluding oneself in a room or field, and then speak one's peace with one's maker. That not only is it about you and God, but it's actually about also getting away from others and taking that space. Because I think you're right. We get so caught up in, after I go to the market, I'll do that thing, or I'll, for me, it's like, I gotta, take care of, and then like, I forget that this sense of real self-care, that this is the space that conflict, even though we have those traits, can sort of go away in this moment, no matter what we can say and how we go about saying it. Michael, you have the floor.
Yeah, I've unmuted myself. Thank you, Rabbi. In the Christian tradition, there's a regrettable teaching that our job is simply to submit to God without question. Submit to God's will. Don't ask questions. And I'm just so attracted to Judaism, where you can argue with God and fight with God and have a quarrel with God. That's so refreshing. It brings a level of truth and honesty into my relationship with God, which I don't always find in my own tradition. Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you. Beautiful comment. I'm going to say I see Emily, and then we're going to move on from this topic. So hold those thoughts. We'll stick around later and talk more. Emily, you have the floor, and then that'll be our last comment on this.
The thing that I found beautiful about this is being a Jewish woman who is educated in the 40s and 50s, where learning Hebrew was not part of what was offered to me. It takes away the excuse that I can't speak to God in Hebrew. It says I may speak to God in any language that I have and that I know. And it is equally acceptable. I can come into the synagogue where the translation is on the other side of the page. The
Mhm.
translation, except for things which are extremely traditional, I have seen vary over the years. However, it's what's in my heart and what's in my soul and what's in my mind that I need to communicate. And if I have something on my mind that I need to work through, I can say it to God, and whether or not he answers and how he answers is irrelevant. It's the exercise.
Fantastic. I want to affirm that and go one step further. I'm going to share our next text. Rita, are you there to read?
I am there.
Okay, would you please read what's on the screen for us? Continuing a couple verses, chapters later in his writing.
If you cannot speak at all in your, I guess, Hebrew, or what does that mean?
Heat bodedut, that is the word for self-seclusion.
Okay. Even saying a single word is also very beneficial. If you can only say one word, keep strong and repeat that word over and over again, countless times. Even if you spend the day after day with that word alone, this in itself is very good. If you are strong and persistent and repeat the word countless times, God will have mercy and open your mouth, and you will be able to express yourself. He also said, speech is very powerful, for isn't it possible for a whisper to prevent a gun from firing?
Thank you for that reading. Just that's like beautiful. Like, oh, and there's not only the time, like, okay, so you might not know the Hebrew, great, talk in your own language. You might not, but like, even if you don't know what to say, still go say it over and over and over and over and over again. So the way I read this is like, walk into the forest, walk into the field behind your house and just say, okay, God, okay, God, okay, God, okay, God, okay, God, okay. Like, I don't know, but I'm here. I'm doing it and I'm saying it. And who knows the power of that and what will come from that and that seeking of connection. I think it's a beautiful, beautiful teaching.
Can I say something, Rabbi?
Sure.
I feel God is always leading my way and bringing to me what I need. And even when I get a light at University Park, I say, that comes quickly, I say, thank you, God. I recognize his presence in everything that I do throughout the day. I just received a call. My uncle is dying as we speak.
So sorry.
But please, dear God, keep him out of pain. He's 96, etc. But expressing gratitude to God gives me a feeling of a relationship with God. Not only do I say, God, I need this, or I write it down or whatever, but to be grateful and thankful for the blessings or the direction he's leading me in or providing me what I need today.
Beautifully said. Thanks, Rita. And amen to your prayer for comfort for your uncle.
Thank you.
Ruth Goldman, I see that you had offered to read. Would you read something from our next section of teachings that I've titled Outpouring of the Soul? You might remember that from the name of the course.
Yes, Sihot Ra'an. It is very good to pour out your thoughts before God like a child pleading before his father. God calls us his children. As it is written, you are children to the Lord your God. Therefore, it is good to express your thoughts and troubles to God, like a child complaining and pestering his father. How good it is when you can awaken your heart and plead until your tears stream from your eyes, and you stand like a little child crying before his father. A confusing thought may enter your mind, but if you stand firm, God will send you another thought to encourage you.
Thank you. Let's take a moment to just sort of drink that in. And we'll open the floor for comments. He's given us so many ways within this expression of hitbodedut, of what we're supposed to do there, because he's acknowledging that the formalism, right, of just the structured prayer service, while important, like we can imagine, he still davens shacharit and mariv and he's a good, pious Jew, but there's also this addition. There's this new way of expressing. What do you notice? What jumps out at you? What's making your heart sing? Yes, Toby Halpern. Need you to unmute though, dear one. Toby, we're still waiting for you to unmute. While we're waiting, Phil or Adrian, did you have a comment? Phil, yes, please.
I did. I can't help but feel that this must have created, these last few paragraphs, must have created such conflict with his contemporaries. Because in our generation right now, while this is different, it's not that different. We meditate. We do make up our own prayers. We do follow our own lead when it comes to how we want to commune. But this being so different, so radically different from the rigidity that existed at that time, must have really put him on the outside.
I think you're right. Yeah. Ruth, or Toby, did you unmute?
I did.
Great. Toby and then Ruth Ornstein.
What struck me about this passage is the intimacy and warmth of the relationship with God. Normally, we think of God as distant, foreboding, judgmental. The fact that it is analogized to a child crying before his father is really beautiful. And we know our children always did that. They need us. They cry. They even pester.
Yeah.
That's what you do to your parent.
Yeah. Complaining and pestering. Never heard of that. Thanks, Toby. Ruth, you have the floor.
I think the thing that most affected me and blows me away in this passage as the others is the call to authenticity, to just being who you are in whatever language, in whatever setting, and that it's okay.
Good. Yeah. Right. Your personal relationship with God that you get to develop between you and God has utmost importance, right? The community is still involved. Like, we're not ignoring the Jewish people or your kahal, your congregation, but this is a space for you and what you need to do for your soul's development in your relationship with God. Beautifully said. Let's take one more comment. I see a few hands up. Who really wants it? Judith does. Judith really wants it.
What's so beautiful about this, I think, is that it's such an understanding of the human being and their needs. And there is a time and a place to stamp your feet and complain and cry and let it all out. But that doesn't last forever. And that given the space and given the allowance and giving the love, one can move on. And I think that's what the hope is, that we will move on, just sort of like the clouds that go by. They don't stay all the time. They move along, and we have the opportunity to move along with our thoughts and with our needs.
Nicely
and
said.
To a more positive, hopefully, place.
Beautifully said. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit in our study because I wanted to, and somebody asked earlier for these texts. I'm happy to include them. I can email them to everybody afterwards, and maybe I'll put them also in the Tuesday email from the temple, but I have everybody who signed up. If you signed up to be here tonight, I've got your email address. So I'll send this text out to everybody and you can drool over them and spill your coffee on them and hold them close to your heart and go out into the field with them at your leisure. And we can talk about them more later. So I want to note that Rabbi Nachman, one of the great things that he said to do, right, was to go out into a field or a room, but he said field first, right? That he wants you to be out in the world. So we're going to spend a couple minutes looking at his relationship with nature. And I want to read this short story because it's just so delicious. So he starts this story in Likutei Tefillot. He says, there's a story of a rabbi whose child used to wander off to spend time alone in a forest. Concerned and curious, one day the rabbi pulled his boy aside to ask him what he was doing. I go to the forest to find God, said the boy. That's wonderful, said the father, but you need not go to the forest to find God. Don't you know that God is the same everywhere? God is, the boy answered, but I'm not. Oh, what a good story. The sweetest. But also notice who's in the wrong here, according to Rebbe Nachman, and who's in the right. The boy, the innocent, the pure. Who's the one that's challenged by all this? The father. And who is the father? Sorry, and who is the boy eventually going to become? Sorry, who is the father? And who is the boy going to like flip? If we put Reb Nachman in the story, he's clearly the boy. And the story of the rabbi, the father, the way that Judaism had been done, this oppositional forces to the practice, right? They're the ones like, no. You stay in the synagogue. You don't go out to the forest. You stay here. You're going to become everything that you need to be for God here and at the home and in your place of work. And the boy's like, no, I change when I go places. I know God's everywhere. It's me. I need the development of self, which is beautiful. So I want to skip down to a famous prayer that he has written. If there's somebody who'd like to read it for us, this beautiful offering of tefillah. Toby, you have the floor. If you would please read us what is often referred to as Rebbe Nachman's prayer. This is, I think, the prayer he's most famously known for.
Master of the universe, grant me the ability to be alone. May it be my custom to go outdoors each day, among the trees and grass, among all growing things, and there may I be alone, and enter into prayer to talk with the one to whom I belong. May I express there everything in my heart, and may all the foliage of the field, all grasses, trees, and plants, awake at my coming to send the powers of their life into the words of my prayer, so that my prayer and speech are made whole, through the life and spirit of all growing things, which are made as one by their transcendent source. May I then pour out the words of my heart before your presence, like water, O Lord, and lift up my hands to you in worship on my behalf and that of my children.
Amen. So friends, let's drink that in for a moment. We'll have time for a couple comments. What do you notice about this prayer? Why do you think that of all of the things that he's written, this is the one that people refer to as Rebbe Nachman's prayer? Diane, yes, please.
I'm not answering your question, but what struck me about this is he seems to be a precursor to the mindfulness, the whole, which is a relatively new idea, the whole idea of dealing with the moment and being at one with the moment and the universe around us. And it's really quite beautiful. And he seems to be a man who's way ahead of his time and his era. It's very impressive.
I agree. So I love that analysis, right? And I think that that's what he or we, if we were to walk out of our house and say this prayer as we headed towards a field or a forest, I would agree with you. But I also want to notice there's a subtlety about his relationship, let's say, with it's not just about the now. There's other things too, right? May it be my custom to go outdoors each day, right? He's seeing that there's more to it. There's the future. It's not only about the now, right? And I think when he has this relationship in this prayer of let's say that part of his living prayer are the trees and grass and plants around him, that he sees them as all part of this sort of flow of the universe, that everything alive is also part of his prayer. And then at the end, he says, not only lift up my hands to you, but the hands of my children. Like he really sees a bigger picture in this moment of mindfulness. Like he's able to encapsulate that and see something broader because he's made it so pinpointed. It's really a striking dichotomy, which is sort of that conflict that I think he was raised around, of how do you navigate those challenges. Do we have any other hands, any other comments? Roz and then Adrian.
Okay, well, first off, with what you were saying, sort of reminds me of the way you generally introduce the Shema as being one with the universe.
Nice.
So that was one thought I had with it, was that's about, what he is saying there. And the psychologists today say, and also for health and healing, that you're supposed to go out into the woods and get a woods bath.
Mm-hmm.
So he is way ahead of his time. The other question I had, and this is one that goes back to this go spend an hour alone. Was he talking just to men? Because women, especially of his era, did not have that hour alone. They had 8 kids hanging on to them.
Great question. So I can't answer it as if I was Rebbe Nachman, but I can answer it in the way that I hope he might have been perceiving what the future was going to unfold and look like. He's part of what we're now calling a neo-Chassidut movement, a neo-Hasidic movement. There's this like progressive nature within Hasidism, which, as I mentioned, was all about, you had one Rebbe, right? One charismatic leader that you followed, and there was that lineage, and you followed that path. There's this blending that's happening now, and in many of those circles, there is a nice amount of progression when it comes to gender role and gender identity. And I feel like maybe at the time, he probably was just talking to the dudes. I think you're right. But I'm hoping that as he would continue to progress, that he might see that. And also, translating it from the Hebrew is a binary language. And so it's directed towards men. But I translate a lot of this stuff, and when I work with it, changing it to they or people or person, because I feel like this is absolutely applicable to anyone on any gender spectrum. Thanks for raising that, Roz. We'll take a comment from Adrian. And is there anyone else who have one last comment? And then Ruth.
I see the first line.
Mm-hmm.
Master of the universe, grant me the ability to be alone, as the key point.
Mm.
If the individual doesn't have the ability to be alone, then all of the rest of that following won't happen.
Mm.
And for so many, being alone is a terrifying thing.
Yeah.
Trying to fill the time with others or television or something to fill the space rather than just be. So for me, that first line is everything.
Beautiful. Fantastically said. I want to hold that thought. I want us to hold it because we're going to need it in a minute, about the inability to walk in the world the way that we might hope. Is like a thing that I think the human condition and our modern society we're greatly challenged by, right? That we know that, gosh, of course this is really useful for us, but yet we get distracted or drawn into, or the headlines or the TV you said, or the argument or the materialism or whatever it is that's drawn us away. Like we know he's right. How healthy and good would this be for us on an everyday basis? Of course, but it's hard. It's challenging. It's fearful. It's not easy. So well said. Ruth, I think you had the floor.
Thank you. This whole exercise and everything that he's written to me seems to be giving us permission to be ourselves, to be authentic, to not have to worry. And as you said, it's hard. It's really hard. And nowadays it's really hard to do, but I'm sure it was hard to do back then. But we all sometimes feel guilty for taking time for ourselves to heal, taking times to study, because we're being selfish. And he, in effect, is saying, you need this. This is beneficial to everybody. And the fact that he's including nature, of course, they didn't live in cities like we live in cities now, but just the inclusion of nature is so healing, it's so therapeutic. And he realized that, that we have to get back to nature because nature is really where it all started and we are part of it.
Nicely said. Thanks, Ruth. I want to respond to one thing, and then Ellie, I see your hand, and that'll be our last comment. The whole thing, if we go back to the beginning when I talked about the simplicity, right? He wants everything to be about joyously being with God. And one of the great things I mentioned, he also battled depression, it seems. And I think one of the things I love about Reb Nachman personally is that you're right, there's this permission. There's permission to have a hard day, or to be angry, or to be in conflict, or to struggle. And he says, great, but don't stay there. Here's the ways out of that. And in staying there, you're denying yourself the connection of godliness, which is pure joy in our lives. It's not saying don't have that. In fact, I think he's saying the opposite. He's saying it's good that you have it. You need to have tough days. You need to have tough moments. You need to have conflict so that you can fully appreciate and be in this moment of joy and be at one with God. Like, great, look at it, confront it, deal with it, and then move forward. I love it. It's like this call to that in like that's underneath all his writing. I love it. Ellie, you have the floor. And I hope I didn't just steal what you were going to say.
No.
Okay.
So there were kind of two things. The first was that he talked about the power of allowing the power of other living beings to come into him, that he could then advocate for them. So it isn't just a selfish human practice. It's we are responsible for helping God maintain all of creation. So there was that, and not just my people, but all people. If you take it that way. And I'm trying to remember the other thing. Also that you can be, from an earlier thing, you can be confused and have opposing thoughts. But if you wait, God will, and you listen, you really take time to tune in and listen, then you will, over time, by having this practice day after day after day, you can hear and discern what God has to say, and it will take you to the next step.
Beautiful. Nice. Very good. Thank you for that. Friends, we're going to wrap up in just a moment, but I want to give you like a sort of a teaser for next time. Next time, we're going to dive into some stories. Like we read some brief stories, but there's some like stories, like he's famous for his stories. That was a Hasidic way of telling Jewish value and ways of being in the world and morals and lessons. So we're going to hear some of his famous stories, or maybe not some famous ones, but some that I really love, that I feel like I want to share with everybody. We're going to talk a little bit more deeply about that sense of joy and what it was like with the depression that he was battling so openly in his story, this mental health stuff. We're going to talk a little bit more about what it means to be present. And I want to share with you, as I gave you his sort of history, I want to show you what today's Hasidic, the Breslover Hasids, what they're doing, what they look like, because you may have seen them and it's fascinating. And it's I think the way that his followers are living today, it's a beauty to behold and can give us inspiration and fun. So I want to share with you some interesting videos and some cool stuff, and a special treat. One of the most beautiful artistic expressions I've seen in a year my mom sent me the other day from a friend of hers who had been in a class that was dealing with Rabbi Nachman stuff that I can't wait to share with you next week. It is like the most gorgeous 2 minutes. It blew me away. But I want to close today's session with a song. And it's one of Reb Nachman's most famous quotes. You've probably heard it. He is quoted in Likutei Maharan saying, "V'da she'adam tzarich la'avor al gesher tsar me'od me'od v'haklal v'ha'yikar shelo yitpached klal." Or as we often sing it, Kol ha'olam kulo gesher tsar me'od v'ha'yikar lo lefached klal. That the world is a very narrow bridge, and the essence, the main point is to not be fearful. How many of you have heard this statement before? Know the song? Oh, good. A handful of you do. I'm going to play you a version that I was just looking for, like a good version to play, and this one caught me. So I'm going to share my screen and just have you enjoy. This is the impact of Rabbi Nachman in the world of creativity, right? We spoke at the very beginning about creating that space, that voice of creation when we speak, and the conflict and the argument, and I can imagine that for this group, band practice probably had some of that, but his words have been resonant for over 200 years. They've been really changing the landscape of how Jewish life looks. So I want you to enjoy this video and this beautiful song based on the writing of "The world is a very narrow bridge." And think about that. What does that mean to be walking in our lives like on a constant narrow bridge? And that the thing that we should hold close, the thing that we should most connect to and hold on to, is that we shouldn't be afraid. So here is Kol ha'olam kulo gesher tsar me'od. By the Ma'ayan Band.
כל העולם כולו גשר צר מאוד, גשר צר מאוד, גשר צר מאוד, כל העולם כולו גשר צר מאוד, גשר צר מאוד. והעיקר והעיקר לא לפחד, לא לפחד כלל, והעיקר והעיקר לא לפחד כלל, והעיקר והעיקר לא לפחד, לא לפחד כלל, והעיקר והעיקר לא לפחד כלל. לי 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 לי
That's fun. One verse. That was like a musical meditation on one verse. They're out in the middle of nowhere. No kippas, right? Modern Israeli group. Just like the impact of Reb Nachman can really be felt in that beautiful reminder that the world is challenging. We walk on a narrow bridge, but we should not be afraid. Because we should have faith and we should have our intimate relationships with God. So I hope that you'll join me again next week. Watch your emails for texts and all that kind of stuff. Judith, do you have any closing remarks before we say goodbye to everybody?
Absolutely, but very briefly, because I don't want to ruin the mood. Thank you so very, very much. This was truly a meaningful and emotional time, and I'm sure I'm speaking for everybody else here. So if this was our first date, I hope everybody will be back for our second date. Thank you very much, Rabbi Shefrin.
Thank you, Judith. Thank you all for being here. And if you have friends, bring them next time, have them sign up. You don't have to have all of the background that we got through today to enjoy the stories and the music and all the fun that we'll look for next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks for your wonderful input and an insight into our studies. Hooray.
Thank you.
Laila Tov.
Laila Tov, Ike. Great to see everybody. Hey, Diana and Jerry. Didn't see you there earlier. Nice to see ya.
Just a question. I don't know if you can hear me.
Just one?
Yeah, just one. It's a big one. Are you familiar with the Jewish renewal movement?
A little bit.
Okay, and Reb Zalman, Shachter Shalomi. Yeah, okay. Just because that's my background.
Yeah, and he comes from this world, right? His
Right.
original, like, yeah.
That's right.
So the lot of the influence, I think the foundational influence for Reb Nachman, which is also some of the same foundational influence for the Chabad movement, also is foundational for the renewal movement. Absolutely.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Told you it was a small question.
That was, hey, that was an easy one. It's really there's amazing stuff being done in that movement. Yes, Tobola.
Yes, Rabbi. You and Rabbi Glickman are always soliciting suggestions for new Jewish music. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
It would be such fun to have a Shabbat devoted to Hasidic music.
Ooh.
I mean, it is so joyous and so transformational that I think people would be dancing in their seats.
Nice. I mean, that's a great suggestion. Some of the tunes we use are would qualify as, right? But that's great. Thanks. I made note of that. That's a nice suggestion. I do like a good Hasidic jig. It's true. It's true. Thanks, Toby. Ruth, yes.
So Rabbi, can I have your email address? Because I want to tell you what tonight meant to me. And it's very important that you know. So I don't have, as a new member, I don't have your email address.
Well, I'm going to put it in the chat right now. How about that?
Perfect.
And you'll get an email from me
Thank you.
anyways, that if you want to respond to.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks for saying that. I'm so glad
Well,
that it
particularly tonight, but it's,
was
I do want to just tell you personally, thank
Please
you.
do. My ears are open.
Okay.
Yeah, I love studying Reb Nachman stuff. I think it's challenging and amazing and inspiring and humbling, and it feels like sometimes it's a little bit too far out there, and then sometimes it's so close to home. It's like,
Oh.
it's just all
And
over the place.
I want to know how I can learn more, but I'm going to write to you. So thank you.
So if you come next week as well, I'm
Oh,
going
I
to show
will.
you my collection of Reb Nachman books, so that you can keep going down the Reb Nachman rabbit hole. It's really, it's great because what we saw tonight is his like texts and his prayer and his, and next week we're going to like hear more stories and like music and like this sort of dancing. It's like a different side of him. Which
Well, no, actually, that's the side that I have heard of, about him.
Yeah.
This side is the one that just went right to my heart and soul. And I would like to explain why to you. So thank you.
And the thing that you're familiar with, the maybe the white knit yarmulkes and the dancing and the music, that all the foundation of all that is this, is what we're looking at tonight. Like none of that. If all you're getting is that, you've like missed the foundation. And I say that for not just you, but like the followers of Reb Nachman, who are the ones putting the graffiti up and doing like all rooted in what we're just looking at about that, like the conflict and the pain.
Yes.
And how it comes up and we move through it into joy. I mean, that's like the whole thing. Yeah. All right, friends.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's my honor. Thanks for being my partners in study. I look forward to spending next week with you. And just as a reminder, don't come to temple on Shabbat. Come meet us on Zoom. We'll all be together. Watch for the links in your emails. Come join us at 7 on Zoom. Light candles with us. Bring your candles. Bring your Kiddush cups. And let's celebrate Shabbat together.
Do you ever think you'd say don't come?
It's so fun. Stay at home this Shabbat. I was telling somebody the story the other day. One of my favorite sermons I ever heard, I believe Elka Abramson gave it, and her sermon was lock the doors on Shabbos. But what she meant was get everyone inside shul and then lock the doors. And like all day long family programming and this, that, that. It was like lock the doors on Shabbat, like don't even leave the temple. But the setup was like, don't, lock the doors. So like, why are you locking them? So don't come to shul.
Right. Thank you.
Great to see everybody. Have a wonderful night, friends.
Very much.
Thank you.